I have the wonderful luxury of being between you and dinner or drinks or food or whatever else it is, or going home. So thank you very much for staying after. I appreciate it. I'm going to try not to knock this podium over. My name is Matt, and I'm here today to talk to you. I realize I'm probably one of the blue or defensive talks today. At least I'm going to finish off that way. I love seeing when they ask for call for papers and they put in there like, oh yeah, you can also submit stuff on like, you know, digital forensics or defense if you want. And I'm like, awesome. We're going to definitely take advantage of that because I like the ability to sit in a room. By the way, is it nice to be back at an actual conference again? Not virtual? Amazing. So good to be back in person. Yeah, but in any event, I like the idea of watching someone escape out of a container followed up by ways to detect adversary activity. Nowhere else can you get all this in one place. Huge fan of that, so thank you. And to my previous speakers as well, wherever you guys are sitting, that was an awesome presentation. Thank you. Everything today has been great. That being said, today I'm here to talk about striking down Cobalt Strike. Now, I've got a handful of reasons why I wanted to talk about this. The biggest one being the absolute proliferation of this tool and just how much you see it going on in attacks out there. Hands up if you've heard of Cobalt Strike before. I'm hoping it's most of the room, okay? Maybe, I don't know. It's a loose calculation, we'll see. But Cobalt Strike is, we'll talk about what it is in just a moment here, but I went and I did some really basic searches, some really basic highlights across different types of research sites, threat news reports, and things like that. And you don't have to be familiar with all of these different sources, but let's just all agree on one thing. If I go and Google attacker Cobalt Strike, hack Cobalt Strike, things like that, it is an extremely popular toolkit, an extremely popular platform that is used by adversaries for all sorts of things. Now, I have to insert a little divider in between the word adversaries when I call them adversaries, because believe it or not, this is actually not a piece of malware. For anyone who's used this or seen this or encountered this before, Cobalt Strike is not intended to be a piece of malware. It's intended to be an adversary emulation tool, a red team tool, or a pen testing tool. Now, I find it kind of an interesting juxtaposition of attackers using an adversary emulation tool, but they're not supposed to be using it, but the tool is meant to emulate adversaries, but they're using, never mind, doesn't matter. We won't go through all that circular logic. We'll just say it's very prolific, it's used all over the place. The other reason why I think Cobalt Strike is very popular amongst adversaries is because all of these different steps of the attacker lifecycle, by the way, if you're not familiar with all those arrows, that's the attacker lifecycle. These are the different stages that an adversary is going to go through as they are infiltrating a network and trying to attack on their objectives. Has anyone heard of the Lockheed Martin cyber kill chain before? The kill chain is another popular framework to describe at a high level what an adversary's approach may look like to an organization. I think the attack lifecycle does a better job because it includes the cyclical nature of what it's like to get into an environment, wash, rinse, and repeat things over and over again. You may land on a system, go look for more. Get on another system, go look for more. You're going to harvest credentials 1, 2, 3, 4 times, as many times as you need to. An actual attack on an organization is multiple steps, multiple systems. It's iterative in nature, and I like the fact that the adversary lifecycle captures that. But in any event, I think the other reason Cobalt Strike captures a lot of popularity is because all of these different steps can be achieved using the same platform, the same GUI, the same interface, the same command line. We'll talk about some of how those different steps can be achieved. But if I'm an adversary, and by the way, pop quiz for everyone here, are adversaries lazy or really, really hard workers? I'm not talking about you pen testers or red teamers out there. I'm talking about like actual nation state attackers. Any guesses? Anyone want to yell out an answer for me? They're very lazy. They're very lazy. To all who said hard workers, there are some. There's always niche cases. Everything I describe, there's always going to be a caveat somewhere else. But a lot of adversaries out there are very lazy. And you're going to see this trend pop up. And if you don't believe me, I will happily give you one of my favorite case studies ever. It was an investigation I was performing. I'm a former incident responder. But some of the cases that I've worked, you'd see adversaries get on a system, download a tool, and then on that infected system, Google how to use that particular tool. Copy pasting. You know, everyone here knows the joke about like copy pasting from Stack Overflow is how you make a startup or how you build a company. Guess how you hack a network? You copy paste from GitHub. That's just how it works. We're going to see examples of this a little bit later on. My point being, adversaries are very, very lazy. And I say that with all love and care for the people who have kept me employed for a long period of time. But I'll just simply say it is much easier if I have everything inside of one place. I'm also going to throw a little bit of shade. Anyone here ever used Metasploit before? How often when you're using Metasploit do you have to Google, look up, or remember what it takes to build a payload? Tell me I'm wrong. MSF Venom, the command line structure, is something that you probably have to look up every now and then unless you're creating them every single day. And even then, that's like a pre-packaged payload builder for you. Cobalt Strike just gives you the ability to create one template and everything follows that template from there on out. My point being, I think adversaries tend to like these types of tools because they're wrapped inside of nice little GUI packages that allow you to just click, point, write simple commands and stuff like that and go on your way. Now, the funny thing about this is the folks who use Cobalt Strike will tell you, oh no, we use it because it's really good at evading detections. It's really good at getting through all the detections that everyone has in place. And I'm here to say, well, after today, we're going to disprove that particular theory. So lazy is my resource there. For anyone who maybe has not used this or has not really heard of this before, I've given you kind of the overall graphical view of Cobalt Strike. The text-based version, it's a closed source penetration testing tool that can be purchased on a discretionary basis. I say this discretionary basis because technically, if you use Cobalt Strike, you have gone through the interview or the I'll call it the information gathering process of actually purchasing this particular tool. You can't just go and sign up and buy it. You actually have to email them and request a purchase, and they ask, what do you intend to use this for? Why are you purchasing this thing? It is not cheap. It's $2,500 US, at least the last I checked, it was $2,500 US. It is, for that reason, it is somewhat closed source. You can't just go and download it. You've got to actually have a license. So if there's all these steps in place, why is it this very wildly popular adversarial tool? Well, primarily because there's also stolen and cracked versions of it out there. They do not have legitimate licenses, but again, they're cracked. And if you are someone who makes a living off of hacking other people's networks, do you really think, or sorry, illegally hacking other people's networks, do you really think a broken license key is going to stop you or be in the way? Let's be very honest. A lot of us in this room got our start with broken license keys. So, well, I didn't say that out loud. We'll just leave that there. But again, we assume that adversaries cannot purchase it, so why on earth are they using it so much? Don't worry, we'll come back to this. I added a little note here. There's been some research published in the past couple of days that we'll come back to. But long story short, adversaries have their hands on it. They're allowed to use it. So a lot of keywords here from this particular platform as I look at it. It's an all-in-one platform. It's very customizable and modular. I can bring all sorts of features into it. There are some features that are unique to the platform itself. Please, by no means, do not think I am throwing any shade on the developers or the folks behind Cobalt Strike or the folks who use it legitimately. It is an extremely powerful platform in the right hands. The problem is, in the wrong hands, none of these attributes go away. It is still an extremely powerful platform that gets misused. The last two things are, I think, some of its key features, or at least the reason why it's grown in popularity. The graphical interface allows for easy attack management. And believe it or not, if you haven't used this tool before, there's also automated reporting at the end. You can get a complete dump of all the things that you've done during a session. It is very, very long and a lot of stuff to look through, very verbose, but again, it's all there for automated reporting. I think that makes life a little bit easier. Couple notes about the architecture. Now, some of the terms for Cobalt Strike I'm going to use fairly interchangeably throughout this presentation, just for the sake of conversation. I'm going to make it a little bit easier. But you're going to hear me talk a lot about the concept of a listener or a beacon. Long story short, we are creating a thing that executes on a victim system that can hopefully reach back to a C2 server and allow us to do additional things on that system. Cobalt Strike does have the ability to determine C2 connectivity and capabilities. We'll talk about that in just a moment. From a beaconing perspective, from a protocol perspective, some of the most common options you're going to see out there are going to be DNS, HTTP, and HTTPS, which are commonly used for C2. And per the help manual, SMB and TCP are often used for peer-to-peer or lateral movement techniques in that case. Across all the research I've done, all the blog posts, everything about Cobalt Strike, DNS, HTTP, and HTTPS tend to be the most commonly used for C2 purposes. For a lot of different reasons, primarily being SMB ports are often not exposed to the internet, at least they shouldn't be, but more importantly, the instructions and the way that the protocols are structured between the two is what allows them to be better for lateral movement or peer-to-peer networking. We'll talk about that in just a moment as we look at some of the hard-coded parts. There's some other connectivity options built into the platform as well. There's an external C2 option, which allows for third-party programs at the communication layer, and you can also configure it to actually, if you want, be a payload handler for things like Metasploit and whatnot. Now, I'm going through all of this because I think the more you know about a weapon or a tool, the more you understand how to detect it, how to see it, how to find it. If I just simply told someone who was colorblind, I want you to find the color red, they would have no idea potentially what that means, assuming they're red colorblind. But if I told someone who had spent a lot of time understanding what red looks like, it's second nature for them. And if I say red, they can immediately picture everything in their head that's red. So I tend to spend a lot of time analyzing what makes a tool or what makes it so attractive. Why is it utilized as often as it is? And the malleable profile capability are, I think, one of the other biggest draws for Cobalt Strike. It allows for granular control over C2, comms. We also have malleable PE options, how code is executed, how things are deployed. It is full customization of beacon communication, full customization of how to spawn processes, how to inject threads, what types of artifacts to leave on disk, how stealthy I want you to be in memory. It's also going to control tiny little keyed network artifacts or tiny little C2 artifacts such as interval and jitter, things we'll talk about in a little bit here. The C2 profiles are so powerful, they also allow me to customize a Cobalt Strike beacon to look like some other type of protocol. I can customize it and make it look like Gmail or Google Drive, Wikipedia, OneDrive, or I guess other Microsoft profiles. Why on earth, and feel free to shout out the answer, any of you here, and I'll repeat it just in case you're not loud enough. Why on earth would I want my C2 traffic to look like Wikipedia, or look like Google Drive, or look like Gmail? I'll answer for you. Go ahead. Oh, someone said it. What's that? Firewalls. What type of traffic do we expect to see whitelisted? What type of traffic do we expect to see allowed through? Legitimate services, legitimate tools like that. So adversaries are going to say, wow, if I can make my traffic look like something legitimate, and yes, domain fronting capabilities are baked into the tool as well. Here's a quick preview of some of the malleable profiles that are in there. I just went and grabbed some screenshots to kind of walk through and talk about this. The kind of default GitHub repo for that has APT options, CRIMEWare options, and normal options. Here's the normals. You can look like Amazon, Gmail, Google Drive, things that I've talked about. And here's an example of what a profile is going to look like, or a malleable profile is going to look like. It's going to allow us to control certificate details. We can set things like sleep time, jitter, user agent details, other sleep options, idle options, so on and so forth. I can also go as far as to configure various types of requests, protocol-specific requests. If I have an HTTP beacon or an HTTP listener, for example, I might want to change parameters between my GET and my POST requests. I'm not sure if anyone is paying too much attention to this, but notice the URI for a GET and a POST are different in this case. The URI for a GET goes to viewer NG, a POST goes to viewers NG across the profile. That one little character might be really important at breaking hard-coded detections, or I should say inflexible detections, if you will. But this is the beauty of that type of profile, is I'm able to create a profile, determine how everything's going to look on a victim network. My server acts accordingly, my client acts accordingly as well. Now, I tend to find a little bit of a difference between the two here, because as customizable as you can make Cobalt Strike, as customizable as I can make this profile, there's also a lot of other things that we can recognize in the tool that are, or in the platform, that are actually fairly hard-coded. And for that reason, I'm going to focus on the things that are hard-coded, because the goal of this talk is to, again, understand the intricacies of the platform and things that we can use against it to detect that type of activity. There's finite options inside of Cobalt Strike. And when I say finite options, what I'm really talking about is I'm talking about the Windows operating system. Past couple talks have focused on various types of calls and things and various exploits, vulnerabilities that are out there. I love seeing the discussion 2 talks ago about LSAS and protected processes and things like that. But I think about attacking a system, or attacking the Windows operating system at least, as a very, very wide to narrow funnel. And what I mean by that is there are tons of ways to break into a system. The newer the operating system, there's really only a handful of ways to steal passwords. And when I say handful, I'm not obviously talking about only 5, but it gets down to a point where it's like, all right, well, there's really only a set number of ways to do this, and guess what? Because I know my adversaries are lazy, someone said this in an earlier talk, they're gonna choose the path of least what? Resistance that's out there. So when I say finite, I mean, I can build as many different capabilities to dump passwords as I want, but guess what? They're all going after either the same process, the same protected space, or the same user accounts. I think this creates space for detection capabilities. I grabbed this quote from a blog post about Cobalt Strike payloads. Raw payloads have a predefined structure and binary format with particular placeholders, and guess what? If you legitimately purchase Cobalt Strike, your customer ID is also embedded in your configurations for the payload and the beacon as well. I kind of like this. There's some interesting attribution that I think can be done if you have a legitimate person using this, but of course you're going to need very, very deep insight into network traffic, which we'll talk about in just a moment. So if you remember a few minutes ago, we talked about the the malleable profiles. Within that, there is a stage option. The stage block inside the malleable profile controls how the beacon is loaded into memory and the content of various DLLs and things like that. There are multiple options available. But guess what? And this is what I talk about for that funnel. I can sit here and say all day long about how amazing it is to inject code and allocate things into memory and do all sorts of evasive stuff. But guess what? There's 3 configurable options when it comes to how the loader allocates memory in here. 3 options, that's it. Virtual alloc, heap alloc, or map view of file. You're going to want to remember these actually for a little bit later on. But if I'm writing AV software, or I'm writing detections that are monitoring memory operations, I now understand the 3 potential functions that are going to be utilized here. This is actually what a lot of the next-gen detection software is doing these days. It's monitoring those types of functions, those DLL calls, to see what types of things are loaded into memory. Because let's be clear, are these bad functions? Someone shaking, okay, at least one person shaking their head. These are built into Windows. These are built into the operating system. There's no malicious function here. There's an abuse of a legitimate function. And that's what a lot of your endpoint detection software are looking for. There's a bunch of other options built into the block here, into the stage block as well, that allows for different sorts of evasion techniques. Just looking through some of them, there's all sorts of like randomization options. The interesting one that's in there is there's also, sorry, not yet. There's also an interesting cleanup option inside of there. There's a sleep option. Depending on the type of protocol that you're using, I find this one to be pretty interesting. If you're using like an SMB beacon and you customize it to clean up after itself and sleep, it'll actually be really, really quiet in memory until it needs to pop up, come for air, ask or listen for a request, and then go back down again. There's an option to clear out memory space when you're not being used and things like that. So again, there are multiple ways to be evasive with this platform. As I said, it's not a useless platform. It is very, very powerful. But that being said, despite all these amazing, highly customizable features, I already told you what I think about a lot of adversaries who are out there. Do we think that adversaries ever actually make the change or upgrade their software or take advantage of a lot of these capabilities? I'm just going to say it right now, and is this being recorded? This is, right? Cool. So I'm going to look in the camera and say a lot of you don't even know the functions of Cobalt Strike and you use it daily. That's for the adversaries out there, not the legitimate red teamers and the legitimate pen testers out there. They don't. I'm going to say after analyzing tons and tons of pieces of Cobalt Strike malware over the years, it's just, you don't see that much difference being dropped into it. A lot of folks, a lot of malicious adversaries are downloading cracked, stolen versions and they're rolling with the defaults. I'm going to show you, I can prove that in network traffic a little bit later on as well. But that's how crazy these profiles get. I can download something with a default profile and it's going to change how my in-memory operations happen. It's going to change my network comms. It's going to change all sorts of activity just based on that malleable profile. Again, if we're not seeing a change in the profile, we're going to continue to see consistent patterns throughout. We're going to talk about those in a little bit here. Now, Everything up to this point has been kind of like basic C2 communications and basic listening activity and C2 comms and whatnot. If I was to take advantage of some of the larger features within Cobalt Strike, or I was taking advantage of some of the post-exploitation options, so having presence on a system is one thing. If I want to then dump passwords or move laterally or elevate my privileges or do something else, well, that's going to be brought down or utilized or implemented as a Windows DLL. To execute or to achieve this, at a very high level, Cobalt Strike is going to spawn a temporary process. It's going to inject whatever feature is requested into that particular process. 4.5 and above allows for explicit injection if specified. And there's a few options, as you can see to the right, that allow you to further hide this type of activity as well. Pop quiz for everyone here, though, to see if anyone's been tracking through any sort of Cobalt Strike activity. There is actually a default process that gets utilized for this. Does anyone know what that default process is? By any chance? There's a blog post from the founder of Cobalt Strike who calls out this particular process because of the number of questions he got from users who said, why do you use this particular process? And there's a whole explanation that goes through 32-bit versus 64-bit in-memory operations, executing code, trying to run x86 inside of 64, so on and so forth. But I like to just summarize it and say, that's great, that's cool, just tell me the process because I'm here to write detections and I'm here to look for malicious activity. And that process is run DLL32. Run DLL32.exe is the default kind of, I'm going to inject something malicious in Cobalt Strike, and we're going to use that to our advantage a little bit later. Just in case anyone was curious, I went through and created a graphical version of what that looks like, but there's an important addition to this phase, or an important addition to this cycle as well. It's going to spawn that temporary process. Run DLL32 is going to be part of the injection cycle as well. Then the result of that injection, the result of whatever command that was, is going to be passed back to my listener via named pipes. Now, anyone here ever done any research or played around with named pipes? Does anyone know, is there a default name for named pipes, or can I name it whatever I want? I could name it whatever I want. If only Cobalt Strike would let us to do that. Instead, we have a list of fairly predictable name pipe names that we see in the tool and in the platform. Pulled this out of various blog posts and across research and things like that. There are a set of default name pipe names that we see across, again, a multitude of investigations. One of the most common ones is MS-agent_, and then there's certain, PID values and stuff. The asterisks are meant to be placeholders in this case. They're not actual literals, they're just placeholders. But there are fairly standard names that we see. Of course, there are ways to go through and change some of this if we want to, but again, I've already told you, a lot of adversaries don't do that. They stick with the defaults, they stick with what's already been presented in the tool for them. We're going to use this to our advantage in just a moment. Remember, right now, we're walking through hard-coded values in the tool. There's also placeholders in the beacon configuration, or when a beacon gets created, that determines the different types of customizations that we talked about. If I'm going to use things like DNS or HTTP, there are places inside of the options or inside of the code that determines what type of comms I'm going to be using. There's ROR13 hashes, which are calculated using the API functions and DLL names, and I can use this to my advantage because I can look at the most common types of protocols that are used out there. And across, again, tons of research, tons of first-hand experience. HTTP and HTTPS C2 traffic is some of the most common use of Cobalt Strike. DNS is also in there. It's less common. But the nice thing about that is I'm able to predict and determine just how Cobalt Strike utilizes or configures itself, and I can use those hashes against it. So up here is a list of the different hashes based on the type of payload. As I mentioned, it's a really quick function, a really quick algorithm of the DLL and the API name behind it. So if my beacon is going to be using DNS, for example, it's going to be calling DNS API.dll and the DNS query_a function in this case. SMB is going to be create named pipe A, HTTP is going to use win-inet, and HTTPS is going to be using win-inet as well, with the only difference being the internet set option function as opposed to the internet open A. Again, we're talking about different protocols in a sense, but when I said to you all earlier that this highly customizable tool does have some finite options based into it, here we go. Finite options. Here's an example of how that particular hash gets generated. Again, kind of just zoomed in on the particular example that's up there. We've also got trends inside of the traffic as well. Protocol traffic also tends to follow trends. So if I've got HTTP or HTTPS, The get is going to be what sends metadata and checks for commands. A post to the C2 is going to be the output of results. So for example, if I tell it to dump passwords, the action dump passwords is going to be retrieved via a get, and the results of that are going to be sent in a post. SMB, listener activity, another example. SMB is not going to be so much C2 kind of request and response. It's going to be more of a listener. SMB are going to be set up as listeners waiting for the parent to send a request back. These are done via SMB write and read commands. And again, this is done listening on a named pipe. Remember what I said about named pipes a few moments ago? We have a default list or a fairly standard common list that gets used. So now I'm understanding more about how the activity can take place, how the network connectivity can take place, and I'm going to use my knowledge of how the agent or how the beacon sets itself up to say, great, so if I have a list of pipe names and I understand how the agent can communicate, I now have a stronger chance of potentially identifying SMB connectivity. I brought the adversarial lifecycle back into this because I also want to take a look at the way that the tool or the way that the platform executes on some of these at various stages here. First one we'll look at is privilege escalation. There are a handful of options inside of privilege escalation. I didn't bring them all in here. I just focus on some of the key ones that we see. Sometimes it's really straightforward. You can just tell Cobalt Strike, I want to elevate, and it just elevates. You got to provide an exploit name. Again, I go back to the days of Metasploit where you're kind of like trying to look through the database and remember exactly what the name of that exploit was. Has anyone been through that process before where you're trying to search through that? No, maybe it's just me. I can never remember the name of every single exploit that I ever want to use, but I'll just mention that it makes it fairly trivial and fairly straightforward here for you. Get system, get privs, and I threw an asterisk next to pass the hash, run as, and run as admin because we'll also see those utilized in lateral movement, but they can also serve as a form of privilege escalation as well. Now, lateral movement's where I tend to spend a lot of time on building detections. Can anyone, and I know I'm making you be involved and interactive in the last talk of the day, but can anyone think of why lateral movement creates unique opportunities that other stages simply do not? I'll give you a hint. Lateral movement is 1 or n+1 systems. Lateral movement needs a to and a from. Lateral movement is 2, minimum 2. I've got to be able to go from somewhere to somewhere. So if I have a bunch of artifacts created on the system from something like this, how many systems do I now have artifacts created on because of activity like that? At least 2. Anytime there's an activity by an adversary that involves multiple systems, I'm rubbing my hands and saying this is fantastic because now I've got multiple groups of artifacts all in one place. Again, a few key commands that we'll see out of here. Port scanning, run as, pass the hash, jump, remote exec, and SSH are some sample Cobalt Strike commands that can be used. Remember, from an art infrastructure perspective, we've already established persistence. This is an adversary issuing commands through a listener to a target system, telling it wants to do a certain group of things. A few that I'm going to focus on and provide some screenshots for. The first one is run as. Again, that's very similar to kind of right-clicking and running as a different account or running as an administrator. The goal here is to, once again, try to escalate privileges or act as a different user to achieve different functionality. We can pass the hash built in to the tool. Jumping is where it tends to get a little more intricate or a little more detailed. Jumping is one of my favorite commands to investigate because there's just so many options that get dropped out of here. I can jump using psexec. Quick note, to my knowledge, this is not Cobalt Strike downloading the sysinternals psexec binary and running it for you. It's actually a scripted or a customized version. There's also psexec via PowerShell in there. Then we can also utilize WinRM, but it's really straightforward. You can say, I want to jump from one system to another. Here's how I'm going to do that thing. Let's go. Let's move on our way. And then remote execution. Maybe I don't want an interactive shell on another system. Maybe I actually just want to execute a particular command. Again, it's really straightforward and easy to run. Oh, yikes. I'm not sure what that was. This is a loud noise. Hope everyone's awake. That looks like a can of something down there. All right, in any event. Remote exec is, again, another option that says, hey, I want to interact between two different systems, and I'm going to look for the artifacts on that other system. I left out SSH because, again, SSH I view as kind of like a protocol built into the tool, not something necessarily specific to the tool. So of all of these types of things, all of these different options, capabilities, functionalities built in, what are some of the most commonly observed things that we see Cobalt Strike used for? And again, what I'm doing is I'm playing on the fact that you have this highly customizable, highly malleable platform, and it's mostly used for the same old stuff. abuse of accounts and privileges, moving lateral, using PowerShell, loading malicious code, and the introduction of third-party tools onto a victim system. I find it really, really funny, and I don't know if anyone else has gone through this, but I'll utilize Cobalt Strike in this little tiny story that comes up. There usually seems to be, at least once a month, some massive internet-breaking vulnerability that everyone's just waiting to crack their networks down. Anyone know what I'm talking about? Remember when like Log4Shell dropped and it was like the end of the world? Or when SolarWinds happened, or when Kaseya happened, or when Exchange happened, or when F5 happened, or we could just continue, VMware happened, Citrix, we could keep going down the list if we wanted to. But there always seems to be this massive, just, every piece of software you have, every piece of hardware you have out there is vulnerable, so watch out. And with all these amazing vulnerabilities and these GitHub repositories full of awesome proof of concept code, what do most adversaries use all this power for? Running coin miners, because apparently that's more attractive. The other side of that coin, pun intended, is that adversaries will use all of that to place Cobalt Strike on the system as well. So again, as I said, a lot of times it's a massive entry vector funnel that results into the same platform, the same toolkit. I brought up a screenshot earlier from malware traffic analysis that talked about Cobalt Strike being the eventual stage of multiple drive-by infections, botnet infections, phishing email infections, so on and so forth. It's a widely used platform. So for that reason, understanding more about what the platform does, how it's coded, how it works, gives me the ability to detect and gives me the ability to write detections against its own code or its own built-in options. So we're going to focus on a couple different sides of detection, network and host-based detection. I picked up on network first, because to me, network is, I think, one of the areas, the easiest areas to detect, assuming you have lots of things in place. But it is also the area that often has the least visibility. It's the easiest place, but it's also one of the largest pieces of traffic or largest pieces of telemetry that's out there. But the network is one of the key parts of Cobalt Strike's success. In fact, I would argue it is the key to its success. A C2 is useless if it cannot beacon back home. So my network traffic is going to involve things like initial exploitation, payload download, C2 comms, any lateral movement is going to happen over the network, so we hope. Potential exfiltration. The entire gamut of the attacker-adversary lifecycle usually relies on network connectivity. I cannot have initial access and data exfiltration if I don't have a way to connect to that particular network. But this is, of course, much easier said than done. So I have to caveat this talk by saying I'm aware that I'm just going to like pull up an example of a PCAP and be like, this works, right? It's done. But I'm aware. Network capture is really hard. It can be really hard. But we don't always have to do full PCAP. Number one, we could pivot off of metadata if we wanted to. We could also utilize higher level things like NetFlow and other sorts of network artifacts to say there are ways for me to interrogate network traffic without needing to have a full PCAP. But again, we'll look at ways that makes life either a little bit easier or a little bit harder. All right, anyone see the malware? Well, this is a talk about Cobalt Strike, so assume any screenshot I give you is probably going to be associated with Cobalt Strike. You can safely make that assumption. But I'll go the other route, and I'll simply brought up here. By the way, did anyone immediately notice that it was port 8008? I had this discussion with someone yesterday who looked at this, they were like, that's the wrong port. Before I had even zoomed in, they were like, that's the wrong port. And I was like, how did you pick up on that so quickly? And they're like, I'm just so used to seeing 80 and 443 that when it violated like that mnemonic symbol that I'm used to, it just didn't seem right to me. So there is always, of course, the option of simply saying, well, let's do some port protocol combinations and see if we have any that violate what I would expect to see. It's 2022. It's almost 2023. We have some of the most advanced technology out there, except for the product known as Twitter. But we have some of the most advanced technology out there. And you might be wondering to yourself, Matt, seriously, you're up here talking to me about port protocol mismatches as a detection technique? And I'm going to say, yeah, it still works as a way to get traffic out. It still fails as a widespread implemented detection technique. Now, if any of you are sitting here and being like, that would never work in my network, congratulations. It is now your responsibility to share how to configure a firewall with those who don't know. Because for a lot of folks, hey, can you block this particular port is a 3-week change process to take place. Think about that. Imagine 3 weeks of success to block a firewall port. Anyways, I won't go too much into all of that, but I'll just simply say, yes, things like this still happen and they still work. Now, I'm going to bring up a slide in just a moment that's going to talk about some of the arguments that I get about capturing network traffic, but I'll simply say there's plenty of metadata available. Even though I can't see the raw packet information, there's plenty of metadata available in Cobalt Strike communications, really in any encrypted traffic that I can use to my advantage. We can also utilize some of the default behavior that we've seen in previous cases, previous experience. There's time and time again, we see an example of an initial Cobalt Strike, the initial dropper, if you will, reaching out over plain text HTTP to pull down the subsequent, or I should say the beacon or the next stage malware. And that is the one that switches over to HTTPS. That's the one that switches over to encrypted communications. Now, I tend to say, now that we understand how this works, sometimes this feels almost like, oh, now I know why this works this way. If I create a Cobalt Strike server with this crazy intense malleable profile associated with it, and I'm deploying malware out there, I need a way to get that profile, to get that installer, get that beacon on that particular system. A second stage downloader is not really out of the ordinary, nor is it something we would not expect to see. Furthermore, if I'm utilizing a previous compromise or another form of malware, like a botnet or something like that, to put Cobalt Strike on a system, I might have to utilize that first or that primary pieces of malware download mechanisms in order to get my encrypted beacon on that particular system. So there's always a chance that we will see some sort of HTTP plain text traffic. The reason I bring this up here is sometimes when I'm talking to folks about network analysis and network detection, they tend to go the route of, oh, it's encrypted, I can't see anything, so we're done, right? And I say, if you bet on that, the adversary is assuming you're going to bet on that, and they're going to hide in plain sight. And in a lot of cases, we'll actually be able to see PE files being brought down over plain text HTTP. Folks, that is a plain text HTTP protocol and a Cobalt Strike installer being downloaded, reverse engineered to your heart's content. It is right there, easy to see. We can also utilize some protocol mismatching to our advantage here. Over on the left-hand side of this is the HTTP host header. Does anyone here send all of their traffic to IP addresses only? I would hope not, unless you're, of course, in a lab or a known environment. Most of the time when we're interacting with external networks, it's done through FQDNs. There's a lot of websites that we interact with. Very rarely do we bring the actual IP to the table, unless, of course, it's a hard-coded C2 or a hard-coded command that's in there. I've already kind of mentioned here that your network analysis can extend just beyond PCAP. We can do really simple things like PE downloads, IP host names, or port protocol combinations. I'd also recommend bringing network traffic into more advanced network analysis tools. I gave a few examples up here: Zeek, Snort, Suricata, and then whatever NDR you might have in place right now. Point being, you'd be surprised at how many detections are built into some of these default tools, or sorry, how many of these are built into them by default. You'd also be surprised at how rare it is for adversaries to deviate from those particular defaults. And then to answer the argument, but Matt, wait, it's encrypted, what can we do about that? I usually come back and I say, if it's encrypted, you are not dead in the water. There is more to look at. Go through and profile that traffic. Anyone here, by a show of hands, familiar with JA3 or JA3S hashes, for example? That's one way that you can profile client hello, server hello communications. Because guess what? I've already given you the lowdown of how you can configure a Cobalt Strike agent to communicate outbound. If I'm utilizing an encrypted profile or an encrypted malleable profile, guess what? The way that the agent says hello, the way that the agent reaches out is going to follow the parameters I've put in that particular profile. The way that the server says hello back is going to, once again, be respective of those particular details. So I just did some really quick analysis right here. This is actually the exact same PCAP as this initial stage right here. And I went through and I did some calculation. I didn't, but the tool did. Went through and figured out the JA3 hash and the JA3S, so the client hello, the server hello for that particular traffic. Ran a quick filter, and I just did a quick profile. And I said, I took one client hello, generated a JA3 hash from it, and I pivoted into 4 different IP addresses. Love it. Anytime I can get some sort of indicator that allows me to pivot from one to many, I'll happily take that. I performed some of the exact same analysis against the server as well, and guess what? Server, I don't have the screenshot of it up here, but the server was the exact same result. What this is telling you is that there are multiple IP addresses out there, multiple forms of HTTPS C2 communications, but the way that the client says hello across those websites and those various installers is exactly the same. Cool. Now I just found a way to profile encrypted traffic and detect potential Cobalt Strike agents in my environment. Love it. I'll happily take that advantage. I also go as far with folks and I say, hey, you can also just take a look at certificate details as well, because guess what most adversaries are doing? When they're utilizing encrypted channels, they've got to have certificates associated with this. Anyone here think an adversary is going to go through all the trouble of building a legitimate domain and setting up a legitimate certificate and doing all those things? Some of them will. Most of the time, though, it's a droplet or some sort of VPS out there, and what sort of encryption or what sort of tool am I going to use to quickly self-sign my communication or quickly generate a certificate for myself? Let's encrypt. You'd be surprised again, a lot of times, just how quickly adversaries will default to the normal stuff. Take a look at the parameters for this certificate as well. Internet Widgets Pty Limited, state or province name, some state. Great, thank you for taking the time to make it really easy. My favorite one though is common name, local host. This is an externally facing C2 server. That's what the certificate looks like. I'll take those values all day long because I'm going to go and build detections on this traffic and say if this comes across the wire, I don't want to see this at all. We'll also zoom in on host detection. Cobalt Strike requires a host. Remember, it's got to be installed on something. I usually tell folks every time I talk about malware showing up on a system, take everyone in this room right here, across the tens or hundreds of millions of systems that we all have interacted with over the course of our lives, never in the history of computing have ones and zeros fallen in line and that Cobalt Strike just appears on there. Doesn't work that way. Someone puts malware on a system. A process or a human or a script or some sort of automated whatever puts malware on a system. This is where Cobalt Strike tends to be a little bit more elusive. However, it is not as elusive as everyone thinks. That's kind of one of the lines that I called out in the abstract for this talk as well. It's not as elusive as everyone thinks because it may have amazing capabilities built into it. You may be able to customize shellcode execution and change all sorts of in-memory operations, utilize reflective DLL loading, all that kind of stuff. Guess what? It still has to interact with the system, interact with memory, carve out or allocate space, interact with processes, inject its code in there. It's going to leave telltale signs all over the place. And the other reason I highlighted PowerShell in this particular talk right here or in this particular slide is because a lot of those advanced capabilities that Cobalt Strike brings to the table, it utilizes PowerShell as its workhorse to do a lot of that work for it. So if I tell you, guess what? There's a significant usage of PowerShell across Cobalt Strike. What do you think you should start detecting against? Any thoughts? Someone said PowerShell logs. 100% right. One of the best resources that are out there. And again, here we are. Matt, it's 2022, and you're telling me that I need to be looking through PowerShell logs? Folks, I don't know if there's an Italian version of this phrase, but if it ain't broke, don't fix it. PowerShell works as an attacker, as an adversary's tool, because guess what? It works. Not a lot of folks are detecting or collecting PowerShell logs or analyzing PowerShell logs as good as they should be. There's two big event IDs of interest. I'm going to talk about why these are. It's 4103 and 4104. These are going to be the ones that actually capture script block contents or command contents as their invocator, as they're run on a particular system. Which one are we interested in? Pop quiz. The quick answer, both. And again, I'm aware that I'm standing between you and food and beverages, so I'll give you the answer on that one. Both. We're interested in both because one of them is local, one of them is remote. I want to know what's happening there. All right, here you go, everyone. Here's Cobalt Strike in the form of a PowerShell log. Can you all see the malware? Again, if I'm bringing up the screenshot in a Cobalt Strike talk, you should assume there's malware on there. This is just a screenshot from a 4103 event that captures various pieces of code. I've highlighted two big boxes here for you. One of them is calls to a certain particular system reflection assembly name, and the second one is a variable at the bottom of the screen that is declaring a byte array to subsequently be injected into memory. This is the type of stuff I love to see in logs. Now, you may notice there's a nice little base 64 string at the end of that. You better believe we're going to take that thing to some sort of decoding tool and figure out what's going on inside of there. But my point remains the same. This is inside of the Windows event log. This is not me reverse engineering some crazy malware and going through all sorts of deobfuscation and whatnot. This is plain text JSON event log data. I'll take it all day long. By the way, that's the command that ran this particular data right here. That's the beginning of it. It was PowerShell.exe -nop-w hidden -ec. Oh, now we get into some other interesting sides of PowerShell detection as well. This is one of my favorite discussions to have, because this is a trick that not only works for Cobalt Strike, but also works for a majority of PowerShell abuse that's out there. By the way, you might be able to go and find posts and whatnot. Am I short on time? Maybe? I need to hurry up? He's telling me I need to hurry up. Yes? Hurry up? Okay. We only have 45 slides left. Is that okay? I'm kidding. I'm joking with you. It's all right. All right. We can go through and utilize the way that PowerShell is launched in order to kick off keyword searches. There's a few different switches that you're likely to see in PowerShell abuse. Things like don't load a profile, hide the window, I'm passing in base 64, do not create an interactive prompt. And guess what? There was some really cool research done that went in and said, how many ways can you alias a PowerShell commandlet? How many ways can you alias a switch? Some folks over at Unit 42 went and did analysis across 4,100 samples, and look what they found. Multiple ways to encode base 64 data. Multiple ways to hide a window. Does that mean we write one detection and forget about it and say we're done? No. This right here, everyone, is proof that our detections are working because adversaries are trying new and newer techniques. Process execution, I'm going to focus on a couple of different things. I'm going to focus on process start, service creation, a form of persistence, as well as potential privilege escalation, and a way to execute as well. But I'm also going to rope in another tool called Sysmon. Anyone here heard of Sysmon before? I hope. Sysmon is an extremely granular tool that's going to bring all sorts of capabilities, visibility to my environment. I'm going to look for things like process creation, network events taking place, remote threads, process access, network pipe, process tampering, so on and so forth. Here's an example 7045 service creation event. In this case right here, I'm going to be, again, looking for things like network share access, accessing local hosts. This is default listener behavior. Accessing the admin share on my local host to receive an executable or a DLL, execute that thing, inject it into memory. We already know what that particular process looks like. I've also got some examples here of various Sysmon IDs where I'm going to zoom in on what it looks like to see PowerShell commands being executed, network pipes being created. Take a look at that default pipe name, by the way. There's our /MSSE, one that we've seen before. Remember that list I told you earlier? Always there. And last but not least, for account activity, we're also going to look across various sorts of authentication events, process creation, and things like that. This is where I'm looking for accounts that have been involved in various parts of malicious activity. All right, 2 more little sections and then we're done, I promise. I was going to go through and spend a lot of time, and this is, remember I said earlier, there's some cool stuff that's happened in the past 2 days I'm going to bring up here. I was going to go through writing Yara signatures with y'all, but guess what? There was an article published a day and a half ago by Google Cloud Security, aka the folks at Chronicle, talking about making PowerShell abuse easier to detect, harder to abuse. And look what they did. They went through and they started writing Yara signatures. Anyone recognize these different function API calls here? There we go. There's our API calls we called out earlier. There's the various functions. They wrote Yara signatures to look for those hashes. They wrote Yara signatures to look for the network connections, the network hashes being built in there. There's also a wealth of Sigma rules out there, but guess what? And I'll finish on this little note right here. Sigma rules that are out there, folks, they work for Cobalt Strike, but a lot of times they're looking for just general malicious system activity. Run DLL without any arguments provided to it. Service creation, account abuse, and things like that. So my point being, and I'll finish on this one, because I've got a nice little list of references that I do not want to read to you. You can read yourself. But I'll simply finish on this. It's an amazingly capable platform, and a huge hats off to the developers who created this thing, and a huge thumbs down to the adversaries that abuse it. You're not as elusive as you think you are. There are a wealth of artifacts, and I promise you, as blue teamers, as defenders, we're going to find them. We're going to detect it. We're going to find it in your network. I'm going to make it to the point where Cobalt Strike is going to be so obsolete, it's not really going to be worth their time to use it anymore. And with that said, I'm going to say I'm done. We're short on time anyways. I know I'm again between you and food and beverages. And I'm going to say as the last presenter today, thanks everyone for joining me. Thanks for staying. Thanks for hanging out. You're in a beautiful city here, so I hope you have a wonderful night enjoying it. Thank you. All right. I'll leave that there.